The valley lay bathed in gold, the last light of the setting sun wrapping every blade of grass and distant hill in warmth. Shadows stretched long over the earth, as if the land itself sighed, settling in for nightfall. A hush hung in the air, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through tall grass and the distant beat of hooves across the dirt. The herd moved like water, fluid and untamed. Dozens of mustangs surged forward across the open land, manes flying like banners in the wind, hooves striking thunder into the earth. Among them ran a striking dapple-gray stallion, his coat mottled with silver streaks that shimmered in the light. His presence commanded attention, not just for his beauty, but for something older, wilder, more knowing in his eyes. He led not with force, but with quiet authority, glancing now and then toward the horizon, as if watching for something the others could not see. Then he stopped. Without warning, the stallion slowed his gallop and pulled away from the herd. His head lifted high, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. Something had caught his attention. The others, confused, hesitated before thundering on. But he stood still, like stone carved from breath and muscle. His eyes fixed on a figure in the distance, small and still, nestled against the rise of a gentle slope near the valley's edge. At first, it seemed like a shadow, but then the breeze shifted, carrying a scent, faint but familiar, and the stallion's body tensed. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his hooves silent over the earth. From a distance, the townsfolk watched, hushed behind the fences of nearby farms and open barns. Word had spread fast. The wild ones were back. But no one expected this. She sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the fading warmth of the day. Her hair, silver and wild as the clouds, lifted gently in the breeze. One hand rested on her lap, unmoving. The other gripped the edge of her seat, white-knuckled, though her face remained calm. She was an odd fixture against the soft landscape, fragile, forgotten, yet entirely unafraid. Eleanor Blake had once been the most respected name in 3 counties when it came to horses. Her ranch had raised some of the finest stallions and mares to ever step into a rodeo arena or mountain trail. There had been a time when people drove miles just to watch her ride, fluid, precise, almost like she and the horse shared one heartbeat. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, she was a relic to many, spoken of in whispers and half-faded memories. No one knew exactly why she came to the valley every evening. It had been 15 years since the accident, since the fire, since everything changed. The stallion drew closer. Every step was careful, calculated. He didn't gallop, didn't prance or buck. He walked like he remembered the scent of the woman before him. A strange tension settled over the watchers. Farmers, ranch hands, children held aloft on their fathers' shoulders. The air thickened with expectation. Some clutched their phones, ready to record, unsure of what they were witnessing. Others stood motionless, hearts pounding with something they couldn't name. Eleanor's eyes were sharp, her gaze never leaving the horse. There was no fear. Only a quiet intensity, like she was waiting for something long overdue. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You're not lost," she whispered. "You remember, don't you?" The stallion stopped just a few feet away. His chest rose and fell, a rhythmic echo of the distant mountains. The setting sun caught his coat and lit it like polished stone. He lowered his head slightly, eyes meeting hers. From the edge of the valley, someone gasped. "Is she out of her mind?" a woman whispered, clutching her shawl. "That's a wild Mustang, he could bolt. Hurt her." But no one moved. The spell was too deep. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. Memories stirred behind them, sharp as broken glass. She remembered flames leaping through tall grass, smoke so thick it choked the sun. She remembered the screams of frightened horses, the searing heat as she galloped through fire trying to save them. And she remembered the last look in his eyes, betrayed, panicked, before he bolted into the wilderness, leaving her on the crumbling edge of a canyon trail. The fall had stolen her legs, but the silence that followed had stolen something deeper. She opened her eyes. The stallion had not moved. "You've grown," she murmured. "But I'd know those eyes anywhere." The horse shifted his weight. His ears flicked forward. The town watched, breathless. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled something out, small, metallic, catching the light. A tarnished old pendant, shaped like a running horse. She let it dangle in the fading sun. "I used to tie this to your saddle," she said softly. "Said it'd keep you safe." A gust of wind stirred the grass around them. The horse stepped forward. He was close now, close enough to touch. Close enough that Eleanor could see the faint scar along his flank, just above the knee. A scar she remembered cleaning when he was only a colt, back when she'd first taken him in. No papers. No breeding. Just spirit. Untamable. Until he met her. "You came back," she said, her voice cracking. A tear slipped down her cheek. He reached his head forward, pausing just inches from her outstretched hand. For a moment the world stood still. The birds stopped chirping. The watchers fell silent. Even the wind held its breath. Then his muzzle brushed against her palm. The touch was feather-light, like memory. Like forgiveness. Eleanor closed her eyes again, this time not to retreat from the past, but to feel the present in its fullness. The warmth of his breath. The trust behind the gesture. It was him. She knew it in every trembling fiber of her being. The watchers stared, stunned. What they had seen was not trickery. Not the old woman's madness. It was recognition. Reunion. The stallion stepped back, but only a pace. He turned slightly, looking toward the herd grazing in the distance, then back to her, as if waiting. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Go on," she whispered. "You don't belong in fences." But he didn't move. Instead, he laid down, not fully, but into a crouch, his legs folding beneath him. An invitation. A gesture no wild horse should make. Eleanor blinked, unable to believe what she was seeing. The townsfolk, once whispering and skeptical, now stared in stunned reverence. Somewhere behind the crowd, a boy dropped his phone. No one noticed. The moment stretched, delicate and powerful. A fragile bridge between worlds thought forever broken. Between a woman who had lost everything, and a creature who had once run from her only to return. Night was coming fast. The wind turned cooler. Lights from nearby homes flickered on, casting long fingers of gold across the valley. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He had remembered her. Through fire, through years, through the wild. And though she didn't know what tomorrow held, whether he'd return again or vanish into the dusk, something within her shifted. A door, long rusted shut, now creaked open. The stallion rose. Slowly. Carefully. Their eyes met again. Then he turned and began to walk, not toward the herd, but along the valley ridge. He paused once to look back, just once, before vanishing into the tall grass and twilight. Eleanor watched him go. A breeze caught her silver hair, lifting it behind her like a flag. She smiled, faintly. "I'll be here," she said softly. "Every evening." And somewhere beyond the hill, a whinny answered. The watchers began to drift away, hushed, forever changed by what they had seen. No one quite knew how to explain it. And maybe they didn't need to. Eleanor remained where she was, the light fading gently around her. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, of memories, of promises, of something still possible. The stars began to appear, one by one. She tilted her head up, whispering a quiet thanks to whatever force had brought him back. The valley had never felt so alive. The next morning dawned pale and quiet, dew clinging to the earth like the memory of a dream. Mist drifted low over the valley, curling around fence posts and curling under tree limbs as if reluctant to let the night go. From the warmth of her small cabin near the edge of the pasture, Eleanor sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the open land beyond. A chipped porcelain cup of tea trembled in her hand, not from weakness, but from the ripple of something that had not stirred in her for years. Hope. She hadn't slept. The image of the stallion, the way he had come to her without fear, haunted her in the most beautiful way. Every blink brought him back, those silver-dappled flanks, that steady gaze, the impossible way he had lowered himself beside her. It had not been a hallucination. The ache in her chest told her so. He had remembered. She didn't tell anyone what she had seen, not in full. Let them whisper. Let them believe it was only coincidence, the ramblings of an old woman. Eleanor didn't need their validation. But deep inside, she knew the moment had opened something. And now, she couldn't help but wonder, why had he returned? What had drawn him back after all these years? A soft knock tapped against her front door. Eleanor wheeled herself over and opened it slowly. On her porch stood Daniel McCrae, the young ranch hand who worked part-time up at Miller's farm. Barely 23, with sun-browned skin and wind-roughened hands, Daniel was one of the few who still visited Eleanor, sometimes to fix a loose board or bring supplies. He shifted awkwardly, holding his hat in one hand and a thermos in the other. "Ma'am," he said, eyes darting toward the pasture. You saw him too, didn't you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Who do you mean?" "The stallion. The one yesterday. That was him, wasn't it? The one from the fire." She took a long breath. "You remember that far back? I was 8. My pa used to take me to the Blake Ranch back when you ran that training program. You let me ride Buttercup, even though I was scared stiff. I remember the fire too. And I remember that horse. He was the only one that ran into the smoke when the others tried to flee." Her expression softened. She hadn't known the boy had seen that. Most people had only heard rumors. "I do believe it was him," she said quietly. "But he's not just a horse anymore. He's something else now." Daniel looked at her, brows drawn in curiosity. Eleanor gestured to the bench beside the door. "Sit. Tell me what you saw." He did. Slowly, carefully, as though afraid speaking it aloud would break the magic. He described how the stallion had approached, how he had bowed, not like a beast, but like something older, more deliberate. Like he was offering something. "It felt like he knew you," Daniel said at last. "And he didn't come back just to say hello." Eleanor nodded. That was what troubled her most. The stallion hadn't been passing through. He had chosen to return, and more than that, he had offered her something. But what? The next few days passed in a haze of silence and expectation. Eleanor returned to the same spot every evening, her blanket tucked around her legs, her eyes scanning the hills. The townsfolk began to gather again, curious, hushed. Some brought binoculars. Others, folding chairs and coffee flasks. They came for spectacle but stayed for reverence. But the stallion didn't return. Not the next night. Nor the one after. A quiet unease began to grow within her. What if he had only come to say goodbye? One morning, unable to bear the uncertainty, Eleanor made a decision. With Daniel's help, she retrieved an old leather trunk from the attic, a dust-covered box of memories. Inside were old photographs, rosettes, and a weathered saddle blanket bearing the mark of her former ranch. At the bottom, tucked away as if it were a sin to remember, lay a small black journal. Eleanor flipped it open. Page after page of careful script chronicled every horse she'd trained. But she was looking for only one. Spirit, she whispered, her finger pausing on the name. That was what she had called him, named not for how he looked, but for the way he moved. Like wind. Like smoke. Like something free. The final entry about him was brief. Asterisk ran into the flames. Escaped through west fence. Unaccounted for. Asterisk. She shut the book, heart heavy. 15 years. What had he endured out there? It was Daniel who suggested they try to track him. "We could scout the ridge," he offered. "See if he's nesting somewhere close. Might be watching, just staying back." Eleanor hesitated. The terrain was rough, and she could not navigate it alone. But the pull to find Spirit again overrode her doubts. They began their search that afternoon. Daniel wheeled her as far as the old trail allowed, then used a collapsible board to help her view the hills through a pair of strong binoculars. They scanned ridges, creeks, and hollows, searching for any flash of gray, any stirring in the grass. Birds called overhead. Coyotes yipped in the distance. But no sign of Spirit came. Until Eleanor heard it. A soft, rhythmic thudding hooves. It came from the east, not far from where the tree line thickened. Daniel froze, holding his breath. They waited. Then, from behind a bend in the trail, a shape emerged. But it wasn't Spirit. It was a younger Mustang, sleek and sharp-eyed, his coat a rich chestnut color. He stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the air, his tail flicking. Behind him came another. Then another. A small band of wild horses, unfamiliar but unafraid. Eleanor's mouth parted in disbelief. "They're young," Daniel whispered. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yearlings. Maybe 2 years old. But look at how they move. Graceful. Unhurried. As if trained." And then it struck her. These horses had been with him. Spirit. He had not come alone that day. He had brought a family. She felt the meaning settle in her bones. He hadn't just returned for her. He had come to show her what had become of him. What he had built. She reached out slowly, extending her hand as she had before. The chestnut hesitated but didn't bolt. He stepped closer, nostrils flaring. Then, like a whisper of wind, Spirit appeared. He came from behind the others, calm and steady. His eyes found hers, and this time she understood. He had returned to bring them to her. Not for taming. Not for breaking. But for trust. Eleanor felt a tremor in her soul, like an old door swinging open to the morning. She looked at Daniel, who stared, slack-jawed. "Do you see what this means?" He nodded, slowly. "He brought them to you?" "To teach them," she said. "Not to ride them. Not to sell them. But to teach them trust. Connection." The stallion stepped forward, nuzzling the chestnut gently before turning to Eleanor. Again, he lowered his head. But this time there was no hesitation. The younger horses followed his lead. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Spirit's muzzle again. "You were never lost," she whispered. "You were learning. Preparing." She felt tears sting her eyes. These weren't just wild horses, they were the next chapter. Spirit had led them through fire, wilderness, and danger. And now, he had brought them to her, not as their master, but as their equal. Their bridge. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the hills. Eleanor felt a quiet joy swell within her. The ache in her heart that had lingered for 15 years didn't ning. The days that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in years. Word of the stallion's return, of the wild horses accompanying him and their mysterious connection to the elderly woman in the wheelchair, spread far beyond the valley. Some came out of curiosity, others for spectacle, but a few arrived with reverence in their hearts, drawn not by entertainment, but by the quiet magic whispered through the wind. Daniel stayed by Eleanor's side. Whatever had passed between her and Spirit, he had felt it too, a bond forged through time and fire that now pulsed with renewed purpose. Each morning, they returned to the clearing near the tree line, where Spirit and his small herd would wait. There was no fear in their eyes, no wildness that screamed danger. Instead, there was quiet recognition, an understanding that seemed to transcend language. One afternoon, as golden sunlight dripped through the oak branches, Eleanor reached toward the young chestnut again. The filly, still cautious, stepped forward. Her nostrils quivered. This time, she didn't flinch at the touch. Eleanor's hand slid gently down the side of her face, tracing the smooth, warm muscle beneath the coat. "You've taught them well," she murmured to Spirit, who stood a few feet behind, watching. "They trust. They feel safe." Daniel crouched nearby, scribbling observations in a worn leather notebook. "She's different now," he said, nodding at the filly. "Less flighty. There's something gentle in the way she watches you." "They're watching him," Eleanor replied. "They follow his lead. If he trusts, so do they." But even as she spoke those words, a subtle unease was growing beneath the surface. The harmony, the sense of balance, Something was threatening to disturb it. Eleanor had seen it before, long ago when a herd sensed a predator in the distance long before any human eye could detect it. She watched Spirit closely. For the first time, his posture was alert, ears twitching, eyes scanning the distant hills. "Something's changed," she whispered. Daniel paused, looking up from his note. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet. But he's sensing it." That night the wind carried a different tone, colder, sharper. Eleanor lay awake in her bed, her window cracked to let in the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and lonely. Then, silence. The next morning confirmed her fears. Daniel arrived early, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He held a crumpled flyer in his hand. "New development," he said, his voice tight. "Government issued a roundup order. Some land developer filed a petition. Claims the wild herds are interfering with water access and erosion control. The Bureau's moving fast. Choppers, fencing, tranquilizers." Eleanor's chest clenched. "They're coming here?" "Not officially, but this valley's part of the expansion zone. It's only a matter of time." Her breath caught. All those years Spirit had survived in the wild, and now, when he had finally returned, not just alone, but leading others, they were under threat again. "We can't let them take him," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know." That afternoon, Eleanor sat alone at the edge of the field. She could barely see through the tears welling in her eyes. Spirit stood near the filly, the wind brushing through his mane, but something in his gaze was different now, more urgent, more restless. He knew. She wheeled closer, heart thudding in her chest. "Spirit," she said softly, "they're coming. Men with loud machines. Trap. Fear." He turned to her slowly, stepping forward until their faces were nearly touching. The weight of his gaze settled into her like stone. There was sorrow in his eyes, but also strength. She reached out, her fingers brushing his forehead. "What should we do?" That night, she and Daniel made plans. Maps were spread across the table, markers tracing trails and back routes. They spoke in hushed tones, worried the very trees might betray them. The plan wasn't perfect, nothing was, but it was all they had. They would relocate the herd. Not far, just enough to buy time. There was an abandoned canyon beyond the ridge, a place Eleanor had once used for private training, long before her injury. It had high walls, clean water, and dense trees. If they could get the horses there without detection, perhaps they could avoid the roundup long enough to find a legal solution. The next morning, the real challenge began. Leading wild horses, no matter how gentle, was no simple task. Spirit cooperated without protest, but the younger ones hesitated, their instincts pulling them in other directions. Eleanor could not go far beyond the clearing in her chair, so Daniel became her legs, echoing her gentle commands and mimicking the quiet hand signals she had used decades ago. Slowly, one by one, the horses began to move. It took 2 full days. They traveled at dawn and dusk, avoiding the eyes of curious onlookers and the ever-hovering threat of government surveillance. Eleanor remained stationed near the treeline, her heart aching with each hour spent apart from Spirit. But she knew what was at stake. On the 3rd morning, Daniel returned breathless. "They're safe," he said. "In the canyon. All of them." Eleanor exhaled, relief crashing over her like a wave. "And Spirit? He's staying close to the perimeter. Watching." But even in that relief, she felt the clock ticking. It wouldn't take long for the authorities to expand their search. The presence of helicopters in nearby counties had already stirred fear among ranchers and wild horse advocates alike. Tensions were building. Protests were being organized. Petitions were being signed. But none of that would matter if boots and machines reached the valley before action could be taken. Eleanor made a choice. That evening, she wrote a letter. It was not addressed to a person, but to the world, to anyone who would listen. In it, she told the story of Spirit, not as a possession, but as a symbol. She wrote of resilience, of fire, of loyalty and trust built without force. She described the herd, Their youth, their grace, and the responsibility humans had to protect what had chosen to coexist with them, not submit. She posted the letter online, where it quickly spread. Shared first by horse lovers, then by conservationists, then by national media outlet. The headline caught fire. Elderly woman in wheelchair pleads for wild Mustang who saved her life. Thousands responded. Soon, a small group of journalists arrived at Eleanor's home. Cameras filmed her with Spirit at the treeline, capturing the quiet beauty of their connection. They recorded Daniel explaining the herd's relocation and the looming threat of the roundup. The footage was raw, emotional, and immediate. A public outcry followed. The bureau was flooded with calls. Protesters lined the outer roads near the valley. Petitions gained signatures by the hour. Lawmakers in nearby districts began to question the urgency and legality of the roundup order. But Eleanor knew it might not be enough. That night, Spirit came closer than he ever had. She had wheeled herself alone to the pasture, hoping to find solace in the dark. Instead, she found him waiting. He walked toward her silently, then lowered himself to the ground beside her. Her breath caught. They sat like that, two souls molded by time and pain and courage. She rested her hand against his neck. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she whispered. "But you've already saved something in me. You brought me back to life." Spirit turned his head. The sky roared overhead, a dull and insistent hum as the helicopter carved wide, slow circles above the valley. Dust whipped through the air, curling through tree branches and scattering loose leaves across the clearing where Eleanor sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly on the arms of her wheelchair. Spirit stood beside her, unflinching, head high, mane wild in the wind like a banner refusing surrender. Daniel sprinted across the pasture toward them, his voice nearly lost in the thrashing air. "They're coming sooner than we thought," he shouted, breath short. 2 more helicopters sighted 15 miles out. Trucks on the service road. "They're mobilizing." Eleanor didn't flinch. Her eyes, sunken from sleepless nights and emotion, remained locked on the distant rise where the canyon lay hidden. The herd? In place. Still calm, for now. But if they hear this, it could trigger a stampede. She turned to Spirit. "We can't let that happen." As if understanding, Spirit gave a low, deep snort and nudged her arm gently. His body trembled not with fear, but with barely restrained energy, a coiled spring of awareness. The threat was real, and he knew it. Daniel crouched beside her, lowering his voice. "I made a call. That reporter, the one who filmed us? She's bringing a crew. They're already on their way. Said they want to livestream this. Get it in front of every eye in the country before the Bureau acts." Eleanor nodded. "Then we hold the line until they arrive." Spirit shifted, his hooves digging into the dirt. Eleanor glanced at him, her voice a low murmur meant for him alone. "This isn't just about survival anymore, is it? This is about being seen. About not vanishing quietly into history." For years she had lived in silence, watching the world forget the parts of her that had once been vital, wild, and free. But not anymore. Now her voice had weight and her story had wings, and it was being carried by the very creature she had once saved. Minutes later, a white van rolled up the gravel path and stopped abruptly. A small team of journalists and camera operators spilled out, dragging equipment, tripods, and handheld rigs as they raced to set up. The lead reporter, a young woman with wind-blown hair and determined eyes, approached Eleanor quickly. "We're live in 2 minutes," she said. "Tell your story." Eleanor wheeled forward, the cameras adjusting to frame her and Spirit in one shot. The low thrum of the helicopter still loomed above, casting a faint shadow on the ground, but she didn't flinch. She looked directly into the lens. "My name is Eleanor McBride," she said, voice steady. "And I want to talk to you about a horse, a wild Mustang who changed my life. Years ago, I found him abandoned, broken, and terrified. I gave him trust. I gave him time. And then I let him go." She reached for Spirit's neck, her fingers curling into the thick strands of his mane. He came back to me not as a tamed beast, but as a leader. He brought others, young, unscarred. A generation that's never known cruelty. And now they want to take him, cage him, strip the wild from his soul. The camera operator motioned silently that they were live. Eleanor looked back at the camera, her voice rising now, fueled by urgency. This isn't just about horses. This is about what we allow ourselves to destroy. When we take freedom from another living being, we lose something sacred in ourselves. She paused, her face raw with emotion. Don't let them disappear. Not again. The live stream went viral within minutes. Across social media, people watched as an old woman in a wheelchair stood against machines, helicopters, and policy. Viewers from around the country flooded the Bureau's servers with demands, threats of legal action, pleas to reconsider. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Celebrities reposted the stream. Senators retweeted it. But the trucks didn't stop. An hour later, they breached the lower ridge. Daniel spotted them first. 6 Bureau vehicles, 2 with trailer beds, 1 armored. Officers stepped out, their uniforms stark against the forest's softness. They carried tranquilizer rifles. A net gun. One had a coil of rope. They're not backing off, Daniel said. Eleanor stared at the rising dust trail behind them. Then we don't either. Spirit moved between her and the agents, hooves thudding the earth. One of the officers hesitated. Another raised his rifle. Don't, Eleanor cried, wheeling forward, placing herself directly between Spirit and the men. The officer lowered the barrel slightly. Ma'am, you're interfering with a federal roundup. This horse is not a number, she said. He's not a stray. He's not a threat. He's family. The youngest officer glanced toward his superior, uncertain. That's the horse from the video, he murmured. The one going viral. The leader hesitated, then looked toward the camera still rolling just beyond the treeline. His expression tightened. Behind them, more people were arriving. Locals, ranchers, activists holding handmade signs. They formed a loose circle around Eleanor and Spirit. The mood shifted. The officers sensed it too. I didn't need words.